Սիրելի բարեկամներ, վերջերս Միացյալ Ազգերի կազմակերպությունում տեղի ունեցավ ցեղասպանությունների կանխարգելմանը նվիրված կոնֆերանս։ Այժմ ուզում եմ ձեզ ներկայացնել մեր պատրաստած ակնարկը այդ մասին։
It has been several years since the Armenian American Society for Studies on Stress and Genocide held a symposium on preventing genocide at the United Nations under the leadership of Dr. Ani Kalajian. This year, the symposium was entitled Nations Acknowledging Their Dark History, Psychosocial, Economic, and Cultural Perspectives. The conference began with remarks by Armenian Permanent Representative to the UN, Garen Nazarian.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and I would like to welcome the participants of today's panel entitled Towards Preventing Genocide and sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Armenia. I also would like to welcome you to the United Nations and thank the chair, Dr. Ani Kalajian, for putting together the program. We're happy to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Clara Garabedian and Professors Erwin Stup and Denis Papazian among panelists. Today's topic is important and timely. The first high-level meeting of the current session of the General Assembly was dedicated to the 10th anniversary of the Durban Declaration, and the member states of the United Nations had an opportunity to reiterate the urgent need to eliminate the racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and all forms of intolerance. Unfortunately, such intolerance is known to us Armenians not only through the history books and the UN reports. As a nation that has survived the genocide, the most extreme forms of racism and xenophobia, we are morally obligated to act for the prevention of further genocides. 97 years ago, a state-devised plan unleashed a crime whose magnitude and consequences were unparalleled, not only in the history of the Armenian nation, but also in the history of the world. The plan of extermination of Armenians was implemented by the Ottoman Empire's state machine through all its structures and carried out with exact instructions. April of 1915 became a dividing line. The millennia-long journey of the Armenian nation had been stopped and split in two, before and after genocide. The documentary by twice Emmy Award nominated filmmaker Michael Hagopian, that you will be watching shortly, will show you the testimonies of survivors and eyewitnesses and how an entire nation was expelled from its motherland and an Asian culture destroyed. This was the outcome of the state-sponsored policy aimed at the extermination of the Armenians. It was measured that the splinters of the Armenian nation that had managed to miraculously escape the genocide would not be able to recover from the blow, would disappear in the whirlpools of the 5 continents and lose their national identity. But we as a nation and as a state were able to reappear at the international arena to reaffirm that we continue our eternal journey and that we are determined not to allow this such crime to ever happen again. The genocide of Armenians perpetrated in the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923 has been recognized and condemned by numerous countries, parliaments, international organizations, and genocide scholars community. We are grateful to those who in many countries of the world, including the Turkish scholars and citizens, simply citizens, realize that the significance of preventing crime against humanity and stay by our side in the struggle of prevention and recognition. Armenia unequivocally welcomed the clear position adopted by the international community, the member states of the United Nations, in precluding any possibility of immunity to pardon for perpetrators of genocide or other crimes against humanity. Without recognition and condemnation, it will be impossible to develop and implement effective mechanisms of prevention, which is one of the UN's priorities. The references to the survivors of Armenian genocide lead me to recall another important celebration marked by Armenians and Armenia around the world a few months ago, the 150th birthday of Fridtjof Nansen, the first High Commissioner for Refugees. In the most difficult period of my nation, this great Norwegian humanitarian rendered priceless support to the survival of homeland-deprived fragments of Armenians fleeing from the genocide. Holders of the Nansen passports settled in various countries of the world, reaching us as far as South Africa, South America, and Canada. They rose to their feet and partook in the development of the host countries and peoples hosting them. Today, I'm happy to recognize in this room the heirs of those survivors, members of our diaspora, both in their individual capacity or representing the Armenian American community organizations, and namely the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the Tekeyan Culture Association, Knights and Daughters of Vartan, as well as Armenian Constitutional Rights Protective Center and Voices for Freedom that are co-sponsors, and of course the Voice of Armenian Diaspora TV that are covering the event. I thank you all for coming and wish you interesting and productive discussions.
A recognition certificate and monetary reward was presented to the winners of the Genocide Essay Contest, given annually to high school and college students. Among the speakers was award-winning director, producer, and activist Carla Karapetyan. She is a narrator of a film called The River Ran Red, a documentary film directed by Michael Hagopian, which was screened at the gathering. The film presents some interviews from a rare collection of 400 Armenian genocide survivors, part of which was used for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, which holds 52,000 Holocaust survivor interviews.
They remind me of Michael Hagopian, the spirit of Michael, who over 40 years, as he mentioned in the film, collected something like 400 genocide survivors and eyewitnesses. And now those interviews will be available for people all over the world to see and access through the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. We are licensing a digital copy of these interviews. The Armenian Film Foundation will retain the original, but the copy will be made available to universities around the world. So many of the people you saw in this film will be, the entire interview will be available for people who want to study and learn about survivors and eyewitnesses. I've been asked today to, I have to wear my glasses, I apologize. I've been asked to speak about the economic consequences of acknowledging the genocide, and that's an interesting topic. I was asked because the good doctor here saw that I was from the London School of Economics, and I have to tell you the truth, I majored in international politics, not economics. But that's okay. I'll just give you a few of my thoughts. The economic consequences of acknowledging the genocide. Well, we've heard the voices of those survivors in The River Ran Red from Michael Hagopian's film. Michael Hagopian had a very clear mission when he was interviewing those survivors. His thought was, one day there would be a court of law, an international court of law, where survivors' testimonies would be available in a legal process, like a world court of law, like Nuremberg. As many of you here today know, successive Turkish governments have expended considerable energy in denying the Armenian genocide, not only denying it in Turkey itself, but also around the world. My colleagues may discuss some of the reasons for that. For the modern Turkish state, many argue, including myself, that acknowledging the genocide is based on a very basic fear of what the state will have to pay once it acknowledges these crimes of humanity. That term, crimes of humanity, was first used by the British, French, and Russian governments in 1915 when they warned the Ottoman government that it would be punished if it continued with its crimes of humanity against the Armenians. So the fear goes all the way back to the First World War. Then, as now, it's all about the money. Restitution is about money, I would argue. But how much? At Turkey's Day of Reckoning for the Armenian genocide, if that day should come, how will that figure be arrived at? Even if we put aside the very thorny issue of land and territory, how will anyone be able to cost out
the price of a state-sponsored plundering, sellout of Armenian assets. A genocide is often likened to a catastrophe. How do you figure the cost of a hurricane? Insurance companies regularly calculate the price of natural disasters. It's very easy to calculate property damage, buildings, cars, hospitals, schools. In 2009, insurance companies paid $34.9 billion in compensation for natural disasters around the world. And that was considered a low figure. The next year, 2010, the figure shot up to $109 billion. $109 billion. That was considered a high figure. But how do you account for the losses of a state-sponsored exile and murder, as President George W. Bush called it? We know, under the confiscation process of Armenian assets, under Ottoman laws, the temporary laws that allowed for confiscation of Armenian properties, we know that included in that was a very elaborate legal structure by the state, which was designed to disenfranchise the Armenians. Through the Abandoned Property Commission, the Liquidation Commission, the Ottoman state had detailed, was, in a word, a gigantic plundering scheme, as well as a final blow to extinguish the race, argued U.S. Ambassador. There have been several studies of these temporary laws. Historians like Taner Akçam, for example, and other Turkish historians like Said Çetinoglu and Nevzat Ondoran have put flesh on exactly how these schemes worked. The German government apparatus, which included several government ministries, provincial and local authorities, as well as village elders, he argues they were involved in transferring private, ecclesiastical, and community-owned Armenian property into either private or public, a massive shakedown by the state of Armenian assets. Under international law, you can't be a receiver of stolen goods without some kind of punishment. Any country which profits from the spoils of a war crime is culpable, and that culpability under international law does not expire with the passage of time. And as we know, in the last 10 years, the whole issue of restitution in the United States. It started with the New York Life insurance case, which interestingly involved my uncle, Martin Marutian. And now, the floodgates seem to have opened, and we have cases which involve property, gold, more insurance premiums. American corporations have been embroiled in this whole process of using the courts to ascertain and distinguish the assets of Armenians and who should pay. The rise in Armenian claims, in fact, follows the model of Holocaust restitution claims, argues Michael Basler, who is leading the case to reclaim the lands that are now called the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. How much money are we actually talking about? Well, the case brought against the U.S. federal dollars worth of Armenian gold, allegedly looted by the Ottoman government in 1914. And the case is saying, in so many words, the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank was the recipient of stolen goods. What is the value of $8.3 million in today's terms? Not very easy to determine. My first trip to Afghanistan, I was asked to calculate the price of a camel. I was making a documentary about a woman who had been executed by the Taliban in a football stadium. The pictures of that woman being executed in the blue veil were circulated around the world. This woman's legal papers. I came across the price of restitution demanded by her husband's family, the blood debt under Sharia law. The husband's family said they would spare her life if she paid this blood debt. The debt was a certain number of camels and silver ingots. Now, because I was transmitting this documentary to British television, I knew my viewers wouldn't understand what the value of camels and silver ingots were, and so I wanted to research what this really meant, and 3 Sharia legal experts gave me an indication. We did some conversions, and I came up with a figure of $25,000. $25,000 for the price that was the price of her husband's life. That was the amount she'd have to pay to spare her life. She's not one individual. It's about mass murder. What makes it different is it's a state-sponsored act, so a nation, not an individual, is deemed to be responsible for the crime. So for that, how do we determine restitution and the price for that? Well, we have one obvious example, Germany. Germany, since 1952, has paid $60 billion in restitution cost. In money terms, has been lowball $60 billion for 6 million souls, Jews. And we know that the Holocaust, there were many more victims. It's not easy, is it? It's not easy when you consider that you're trying to value the lives of human beings. But it's done all the time in courts, and it's done all the time by insurance companies. More difficult to determine is what we call in economics the opportunity cost. That's a very classic economic term, opportunity cost. That's the cost of the missed opportunity. It's the estimation of what Armenians would have been as a community had they not been exterminated. How do you calculate that? An insurance adjuster could do that pretty easily. Calculate the percentage of Ottoman Turkey's GDP in 1915 attributable to the Armenian population living.
The past and other countries that have done it successfully is a smart idea. Now we are presenting us Outstanding Achievement Award of 2012 to Carla Garabedian. So if you can stand again for all the work that she's done, creating films, documenting the interviews is a very valuable work that we need. The scholars need that. And here is the award. Armenian American Society for Studies on Stress and Genocide is honored to present its 2012 Outstanding Achievement Award to Carla Garabedian, PhD, for your extraordinary contributions to genocide studies nationally and internationally through your extensive research and award-winning films on the 97th anniversary of the Ottoman Turkish genocide.
Thank you very much.
The next speaker was Professor Aaron Staub, also a founding director of the doctoral program in the psychology of peace and violence at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He has studied the roots of altruism, the origins of genocide, violent conflict, and terrorism, and then their prevention, psychological recovery, and reconciliation.
I prepared a brief PowerPoint, but it is too long, so I am going to speak without it. From that film, from the comment we heard from Ani, from everything we know, we understand the horrible, tragic impact of genocide or mass killing, which is often a way station genocide. So what is crucial is to prevent these things. I have studied the origins of genocide and violence between groups for many years. In my first book, I also write about the origins of the Armenian genocide, always because I thought that understanding origins helps us, guides us to understand some of the ways we need to act in order to prevent genocide. Genocide doesn't just spring up, it evolves. It can begin slowly by actions of discrimination, small, limited forms of violence. But individuals, groups, institutions change as a result of their actions. We cannot harm others without justifying our actions, without resistance, without intervening, limiting processes. We are going to move towards more hostility and greater violence. And this evolution can lead to genocide. But because there is an evolution, it is also possible for people to take action to prevent it. But that rarely happens. I talk about bystanders as individuals within a society who are neither perpetrators nor victims, who are in a position to see what's happening and who are in a position to take action. and they often, usually, close their eyes. And even when they see, they don't take action. The same is true of outside groups and the international community. The passivity of bystanders encourages perpetrators. I could quote you from the diary of Goebbels, who was saying when he saw some of the inactions of the international community in relation to the persecution of Jews, that they would all like to do to the Jews what we are. It's often that bystanders are complicit, not only passive. At the time of the genocide of the Armenians, German newspapers were justifying what was happening and were saying that the Armenians, by their actions, brought their fate on themselves. So action, what I call active bystandership, is crucial, but it has to start early, before an intense commitment to violence, before an ideology develops that makes violence extremely, large-scale violence extremely likely. What are some of the elements that contribute to genocide and some of the elements that make it less likely? A very simple one that people have already, the students have talked about, is the devaluation of a group of other people. In most societies that are mixed, some groups are seen in a negative way. Even in societies that are not ethnically or religiously mixed, there are differences in poverty and wealth, and people who have less advantage, people who become poorer along the way, come to be devalued. There can be different kinds of devaluation. Certain kinds are especially dangerous, seeing the other as morally bad, as ready to exploit you. And when this kind of devaluation is combined with that group doing well in that society, because they have an internal culture that enables them to be effective and to achieve, that's an especially dangerous combination. That combination was present for the Armenians in Turkey, for the Jews in Germany, for the Tutsis in Rwanda. It's extremely important when such devaluation and discrimination is present for people to take action to humanize the devalued group. And that can be done way before there is a level of violence and the level of commitment to violence that makes action extremely dangerous. The problem is that, as I said, bystanders usually remain passive. It's very interesting and important that people within a society often don't do anything until a genocide actually begins for Israel. A constructive vision could be an economic community that in many ways benefits both groups and also benefits the region. Now, you cannot prescribe a constructive ideology for a group. They have to create it for themselves. But very often, for good things to happen, there has to be some joining together of external bystanders who can instigate and stimulate internal activities and internal groups who have to be the people who do the kinds of actions that really make a difference on the ground. Another very important source of violence, which points to prevention, is past victimization of the group and unhealed wounds. I could talk about this in relation to Turkey, but it's simpler in the case of Rwanda. In Rwanda, under Belgian overrule, the Tutsis were elevated, and between 1916 especially and 1959, they were dominant, they ruled over the majority, 85% Hutus, and they did so with great thinking about and wanting to return to past greatness. So the European nations, Turkey was identified as the sick man of Europe already at the end of the previous century. So what I'm suggesting is that all these experiences are intertwined with and create the structure that maintains denial. It's a very challenging process, I think, for a country who has moved into that kind of psychological and cultural space to begin a process of acknowledgement. And if you add the material issues to it, it becomes even more challenging. And in a way, I say this with real humility. But I have been thinking about this for many years now, that the Armenian community, by focusing on the extent on the denial that the community does, in a way allows Turkey to continually harm the community. In a way allows Turkey, by its denial, to re-victimize the community. And I don't know if it is possible to kind of shift more to internal processes and also move to friends who acknowledge, because that's also healing, that others acknowledge it. I gave a talk to a large Armenian group and also a general audience last night at Tufts University in Boston. And there was a reception afterwards. And a man came up to me afterwards during the reception, and we were talking about this issue, and he said, you know, my feeling now is stronger about the United States not acknowledging the genocide than about Turkey. And I would share that feeling. And that is something that one can work on. We are supposed to live in a great country that lives up to its values. And certainly it is not inconsistent with the values of the United States not to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. So that, I think, is a worthwhile domain to try to exert influence and tell the American people and the American government, we are part of you. Look at us and look what you are saying. I am going to say just a few words very briefly about our work in Rwanda, because
Professor Stout, if you may stand, we have a small gift for you.
thank you.
And this is a CD, Transforming Ancestral Pain into Meaning, a New Meaning and Lessons Learned.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I appreciate it.
Among the speakers was also Armenian-American historian Professor Denis Papazian.
The causes and cures of genocide. It has been well said that under certain circumstances, any people could commit genocide. Of course, that does not mean that genocide is not a crime or that it should go unpunished. It is a crime, and those who commit it must be punished. Otherwise, the crime will be repeated over and over again. It might also be said that under certain circumstances, any individual of physical competence might commit murder, rape, or thuggery. But it is universally accepted that such crimes should not go unpunished. Therefore, I do not argue in this paper that any one people is inherently genocidal by virtue of their genes or traditions, but rather seek the fundamental elements which allow or encourage genocide among any people. The first of these genocidal elements is the concept of sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty is related to the idea of the divine right of kings, a concept well established in history. The king, as representative of the deity, has complete power over life and death of his subjects. Thus, the king can kill with impunity, since he represents the ultimate authority. He is sovereign and answerable only to God. In more modern times, with the demise of kings, this power has escheated to the state. In other words, the state has inherited the divine right of kings, and with it the power of life and death over its subjects. The state, having inherited the king's sovereignty, has the right to kill under whatever circumstances it deems appropriate. Until recently, this has been the general status of international law. Former instance, a Christian majority persecuting a Jewish minority. Language can also be a divisive factor. Often a linguistic minority can be despised by a linguistic majority and thus persecuted. But more often there must be other distinguishing factors involved before it leads to genocide. These distinguishing factors are either racism or nationalism or some combination thereof. Nationalism and racism are often closely intertwined. It is well known that in certain times and places, white people mistreated black people. And in far few instances, black people have been known to persecute white people, such as in Zimbabwe. But nationalism goes far beyond color racism. It can include various forms of mythical racial purity or unique destinies. It is almost impossible by social science standards to define the nation or nationalism. It can generally be defined as a large group of people who feel a kinship and a common destiny. Usually, a nation has a common territory, but not always, a predominant religion, a common language, a sense of common history, real or imagined, and the hope for a common successful future. A nation is further characterized by its exclusiveness. You can only become a part of the nation if the majority is willing to accept you. Thus, the Jews, who lived in Germany for generations, and in some cases were only 1/4 Jewish by ancestry, were still considered Jews by the predominant controlling group and treated accordingly. They were marked as outsiders, non-members of the group, and thus not enjoying the protection of the group. The same was true of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. They were a distinct and distinctive minority who had their own religion and their own language. They were clearly outsiders, members of a subordinate group. In most cases, during the Armenian genocide, even when Christian Armenians wanted to accept Islam to avoid death, contrary to the movie here, they were refused the privilege since their ancestry was tainted and they could not become pure Muslims. There are many cases of this in the research that I have done. I think the early converts to Islam would find this distinction rather confusing. On the other hand, Armenian children survivors were often gathered up by Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, given Muslim names, and brought into their families to be brought up as true Muslims. Thus, the taint was apparently in the culture and not so much in the so-called blood. Nationalism, as we know it, originated in 18th century Europe as a common man sought identity with his rise in economic status. This desire became even stronger in the bourgeoisie since the new class needed identity of its own apart from that of the aristocracy. In this early period, nationalism was often accompanied by a search for democracy, the overthrow of kings and aristocracies. Thus, we have the period of the 19th century revolutions in Europe. This kind of nationalism, a nationalism of the people, was slower reaching the East and often resided first in the educated classes. Thus, we can argue that Turkish nationalism of the 19th century was only proto-nationalism, an insipid nationalism mixed in and confused with religious identity. It is not at all surprising that Turkish nationalism arose first among the upper classes, who were sent to Europe for their education, and also lower and middle class Turks who received their education in the army from those who had often studied the military sciences in Europe, particularly in Germany. The former attitude was a liberal variety, and the latter a more narrow, exclusivist view of nationalism. Let me have a bit of water here. German liberals in Paris in 1902 The Ottoman Empire was an Ottoman Empire, not a Turkish empire, although the predominant power elites were Turkish. After all, the Ottoman Turks wrested the territory from other Turkish tribes who had arrived before them. In fact, until Turkish nationalism was emerging, the concept of us and them was developing. And there was a reaction among the Muslim elites and population against the Tanzimat, the democratic reform movement which aimed to give all Ottomans, Christians and Muslims alike, equality before the law. Theory was one thing, but tradition and status was another. It is rare that an individual or class will give up status without a struggle. It was in this lethal atmosphere of proto-nationalism and rising religious obscurantism that the Ottoman state began to confront the encroachment of the European powers. The 19th century was not only the century of awakening of democratic impulses and nationalism, it was also a century of imperialism. The Russian Empire extended from the Baltic to the Pacific. The British Empire extended around the world, held together by the British Navy and expeditionary forces. Time committed by its predecessor government under the dictatorship of the Committee for Union and Progress. I lament the fact that the people of Turkey are denied free access to accurate sources because of Article 301 of the Turkish Criminal Code, which makes it a crime to insult Turkishness. This article has been widely used to prevent an airing of the Armenian genocide by the Turkish people so they could arrive at their own conclusions. I lament the fact that such collections of confiscated properties archives and the military ministry archives are not open for objective scholars. But there is a glimmer of hope. The Turkish government has instituted a number of reforms which might make freedom of investigation more possible. Conferences are being held in Istanbul and Ankara on the topic of the Armenian genocide. And even books are being published, although the publisher, Rajib Zarakoglu, has frequently been thrown in jail for his audacity. It is humanism, the understanding that we all, black, white, yellow, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, Armenian, Turks, and all others, are actually one people with one destiny on this frail earth, which holds the key to ending genocide. It is also intellectual freedom, which is vital to bring knowledge, understanding, peace, and harmony amongst people. As long as governments try to control access to the truth, antagonisms will remain. Thus, intellectual freedom is absolutely necessary for settling issues like the Armenian genocide and prevent such other atrocities. To help our fellow Turkish investigators, we have taken some of the work off of their back. We have published the trial records of the Young Turks post-World War I military tribunal held by the Turkish state, court-martials by the Turkish state against the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. These documents have been hard to locate, but Father Gregor, who was mentioned earlier, and others, we've managed to accumulate over 20 years the complete trial record, and we have published it in modern Turkish so that Turks can read it and understand their own history. One of the problems of dealing with Turkish intellectuals today, or pseudo-intellectuals, is they are denied knowing their own history because they don't read Ottoman Turkish. They have no idea what's in the archives. They aren't able to read it. I don't blame them for it, but they should recognize that. So, last sentence. It is a pity that these trials were interrupted and never brought to conclusion, thus leaving a patina of guilt on the whole of the Turkish people, rather than on the individuals who misguided and misled the common man to commit unspeakable crimes. Thank you.
During Professor Papazian's presentation, representatives of the Turkish government expressed their discontent, accusing members of the conference in distorting the historical facts.
government, who they are. The paid stooges.
Let them talk.
The paid stooges of the Turkish government.
Let them talk.
Please, don't respond.
Let
I
them
asked
talk.
you not to respond. Thank you so much. Professor Staub,
Let them talk. Why not?
Professor Staub, I have a question for you about American government.
We wanted to use the point of order. You didn't give us
Security, please. You're standing there.
No.
Please call security. Please call security, sir.
You don't need to call the security. We are the
Professor
security. We know
Staub.
your work.
No.
We come every day here.
You're playing games.
Professor Staub,
You're not
no,
interested
don't
in finding the
respond.
They're
truth.
working for the
Please
government,
don't,
they're misguided.
Yeah.
Doctor, don't respond, please. I'm chairing, please, respect. Professor Staub, you mentioned earlier that how Americans have not acknowledged the genocide, and it's a sad thing.
It's not
but
entirely
you may not
true.
know, it hasn't gone through completely.
In 1952, the American State Department presented a
Right.
plea
So
to
I
the-
just wanted to say
Okay.
that the Armenians in America have been presenting through the legal form since 1952, and it has gone through some improvements, but not totally. So what I wanted to also challenge that Americans have not acknowledged slavery. There has not been a formal apology and a formal, restitution. And the same with the indigenous Americans, Native Americans. I mean, there was some lip service about acknowledgement, but there has not been really genuine.
No.
So let's hear about you. If you have questions, kindly write them down and send it to us, because we will only acknowledge questions that are written. Thank you. Thank you so much. And also, I want to call on Dr. George Hero, who's a history professor at Meaningful College and who has a special program on genocide. And the winners are all from his class, so we'll have a small security. Thank you. Okay, so let's give 1 minute to each have prevented that backlash, and how could we prevent the war in Iraq that killed thousands and thousands of innocent lives? That's the question, and Professor Staub is going to try to respond.
You know, I was talking about difficult life conditions and how people respond, and one of those is when you are attacked. And sadly, at times like that, people often stop using their critical sense. They stop questioning and evaluating things for themselves.
The ongoing genocide in Sudan. But before that, let me tell you that we in Sudan suffered from the Turkish or the Ottoman genocide in 1820, 21, 22. So we are in the same page here. The retaliation was massive, actually, for an event happened, and they came and they wiped villages and cities. The second thing, actually, I want to just to correct you earlier, you mentioned the number. The number of the people who died in Sudan, according to the UN, is 300,000. And this is an old number. This was like 3-4 years ago. So we don't know. Really, I don't know. As a Sudanese who lives in diaspora, I don't have a number. So it is ongoing. Now it is extending to Blue Nile and to the Nubia Mountain. Why are these people killing? We don't know yet. From what I hear from this lovely presentation, that there are some reasoning for that. But as I talked to you, Doctor, on the phone, I'm here just to tell you that we have people who witness those ongoing atrocities.
Thank you for this interview, and first of all, thank you for the film. It was a quite powerful experience, of course. In your presentation, you spoke about retribution, and you spoke about even more rocky subject as our lands. Now, many would say that are on Armenian side that getting Turkey recognized Armenian genocide as it is, it's very challenging. And perhaps for the sake of recognition, we should drop these very difficult subjects that in all likelihood would be highly resistant by Turkish government and by Turkish public. What would you say to these people?
I actually did not mention the whole issue of trying to assess the value of land, because I think that it's difficult at a number of different levels. So I don't have an answer to that question. I actually think, and you notice at the end of what I was talking about, that I truly believe in the democratic process, and I think the example of the Arab Spring should not be underestimated in the effects that it will have in the region, because there are many people in Turkey who are fighting for the basic civil rights to be able to speak freely about their own history. We know what happened to Hrant Dink. We have Recep Zarakolu, who was mentioned today, who was in prison for many different things, but one of the things that he's been accused of is publishing books on the Armenian genocide. And so I think that part of the challenge is for those citizens in Turkey is to think out of the box. I was really trying to push the boundaries in this discussion. Let's think out of the box. Let's think, what kind of value and price can we put on restitution? We always talk about recognition first, then let's talk about restitution. And we have to think about recognition because the two things go together. But what is the shape, the detail of restitution? Yes, we have to talk about the land, absolutely. I'm not trying to say that's not important, but what about all the other things? What about the price of the assets that were confiscated, the properties that were confiscated, the homes and the churches, even the bank assets in and of itself? We're just beginning to, it's the tip of an iceberg where we are now in the court cases there, suing the U.S. Federal Reserve Board for allegedly being in possession of stolen assets. This whole mindset is fundamentally changing the way that we are talking about restitution. And I believe the more that we bring these issues into the legal sphere, the pressure that it puts on the political sphere, that the two things are intertwined. The economics and politics are absolutely intertwined, as I said, because I mentioned Germany. Germany had to pay reparations after the war because of the political climate. There was absolutely no room for there to be any question about that. The Europeans did not want Germany, the Nazism, to come back, and reparations was a way to punish it, and there was no question about it. That did not happen in the Armenian genocide afterwards because the political climate went against the Armenians. And we are still in that same continuum, that power sort of warp of appeasing this crime. The political climate is what's stopping the restitution. So I think all these issues, to answer your question in a very long way, I think all of these issues are important to talk about because we stretch the parameters of debate and we put pressure on the leadership of those people in our community we have to think out of the box, because when the moment comes where restitution becomes number one in the political process, where are the ideas going to be? We have to start thinking now about the value of what it is, the price of what it is we want at the very minimum. We have to think about, if we want reparations, what the shape of that will be. And let's start that dialogue now and let it be part of the democratic process. And in that way, we put the ideas into the political sphere and we start to shake things up.
But just following your argument, you mentioned Arab Spring, for instance. In other words, we would like a Turkish public to be given their democratic right to look at their past and know the truth. But don't you think that if we begin raising such important subjects as land, which in certain way will be translated as attack on their sovereignty, don't you think we're going to lose that public support that we very much need in order to convince Turkish government to recognize us, step one?
I think some people would argue that. I actually think that we should not put any preconditions on this discussion, because we can't dictate to those people living in Turkey what the democratic process should be. In the same way, you can't dictate to Americans how this discussion should go. And I certainly don't appreciate having my free speech constrained by somebody who's saying, you're defaming me by even talking about this subject, which is what happened here today. Actually, the question that the Turkish representatives wanted to ask was, how dare you defame our country by raising these issues?
what do you think you're doing? That was, I think, the question that they were trying to ask. I was getting little snippets of it. And that it's difficult to have a civil discussion about this when you have the complete sort of cognitive dissonance, the lockdown of thought, which is a Turkish diplomatic representative telling me as an American citizen what I can and can't say about this issue. Is like they're trying to impose their value system in Turkey, their Article 301 mentality on me. I'm an American citizen. I'm also a British citizen, and I don't appreciate having my words censored in the United Nations. I don't appreciate it.
Watching your film, and I've seen Screamers also, which was
actually Michael Hagopian's film.
Yes, exactly, but you produced it.
I didn't produce it. It was my narration on it.
Yours narration on it, but you are involved in it, and certainly it shares your views. Have you shown this to Turkish public? Do you get reaction from Turkish side? Because obviously it's incredibly difficult to watch, even for us as Armenians. And while I was watching for a moment, I tried to flip the situation. I thought if somebody would accuse an Armenian policeman in a turn of the century of beating of a child in a wound, it would be quite a horrific thing to face. What kind of reaction do you get from Turkish public?
Well, we can't show it in Turkey because of the laws there, and I think that would be a great opportunity for Turkish citizens to be able to view this movie. The more truth there is, the more possibility of understanding. You have to have the facts and the truth out there for people. You have to expose them to it for them to come to some new level of understanding. That's really important. The most exciting aspect of Michael Hagopian's work is over 40 decades of interviewing survivors and eyewitnesses, that collection of interview material is now going to be available to the world through universities around the world, who will be able to access the interviews in their entirety by accessing the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. And that's new. We have never before, as a community, had our survivors and witnesses' testimonies available in this way. And it's important for any person, student or researcher or human being, to feel the emotion of an eyewitness in the way you did tonight. You saw those testimonies and you felt something. I think that's something that's very important to share. And the Holocaust testimonies are available, 52,000 of them. Testimonies from Rwanda, testimonies from Bosnia and Cambodia will also be in this archive. It's going to be one of the biggest genocide archives, visual history archives in the world. And in that way, I think we can influence people.
Thank you so much, and best of luck in your work.
Thank you.
Yes, you look good. During your presentation, you said two things that caught my attention, and I would like to elaborate on it. First, you said that in order for us to achieve recognition of Armenian genocide in Turkey, we need to understand Turkey.
Absolutely.
And subsequently, you said that there's silver lining in this argument because Turkey is changing.
Right.
Could you elaborate on those 2 points for me?
Yes, inevitably, I remember the story of Kalus Gulbenkian. He was a very wealthy man, and he knew how to make deals. And before he made a deal, he would bring people to one of his palaces. He'd spend 3 days and not talk about business. And then after he knew them psychologically, he brought up business. And the same thing has to be true of the Turks. We have to understand them psychologically. We have to understand their history better than they do, because they're denied the real story of their history. And so I've spent the last 15 years trying to learn Turkish history in a true and accurate way. And I want to prove to some of these people that they are not understanding their own history and therefore coming to wrong conclusions. For example, I tried to point out today that the Committee of Union and Progress controlled the government, and it was a dictatorship, and that these people were put on trial. And Ataturk himself said it was a shameful act what they did. Now, of course, the trials fell apart because the European powers were pushing for territorial advancement, and the Turks said, well, if everyone's going to be punished, why punish our individuals? But that was a mistake on the part of Turkey. They should have punished individuals and said, look, we're not guilty. These people misled us. And I think we have to find ways to explain to Turkey their own history, because they have a mythology that Ataturk developed in his 21-hour talk, in which he created a whole new history of Turkey and closed off the old history by changing the alphabet. And there are a lot of Turks who are honest people, like you and me. They want to find out the truth. And there are more who don't. There are these terrible nationalists. They want to kill people. It's like these football stadium guys who go and riot in the stadium. That you find those all over the place. But we have to deal with enlightened Turks. We have to educate them back and forth so we can change Turkey.
And how is it changing now? You, for instance, you spoke about the political climate that triggered the genocide.
Right.
What type of political climate do you think it has to be now for it to recognize it? What must occur politically within Turkey for it to be open to recognition?
Right. The first thing is that the Turks do want to join the European Union. At least they did very much so. In fact, they changed a lot of their laws to become in compliance with the European standards. They're a little bit disgusted now because the Europeans are pushing them away. Nevertheless, many of these reforms have taken place. Furthermore, they are returning slowly, a couple of Armenian churches. They're returning a couple of things. But we have to realize that there's a tension in Turkey between the conservatives and the reformers. And the conservatives are still in the majority. So the reformers can only move so quickly. And hopefully, by enlightening the Turks, by having conferences there, that slowly we can change things. There is no alternative. There is no alternative. We can wish all we want, we can imagine all we want. When push comes to shove, the Turks themselves, their government has to recognize the genocide and make compensation. No outside people are going to force them to do that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful event. It was in many ways eye-opening for me to hear so many perspectives about such an important issue as an Armenian genocide and atrocities around the world that are taking place today. In your opinion, and I am someone who's been following your work for quite some time, and I see all the important work that you're doing, both in bringing awareness and also promoting forgiveness and promoting reconciliation. How do you think these two forces that are so opposing, and just now we saw members of opposite opinion of Turkish government vigorously opposing the messages that are being heard here. As you mentioned, the pain is there, the hurt is there, it's unsolved. How do you see these two opposing powers coming together to produce a concrete result of forgiveness, reconciliation, and solution?
Well, thank you so much for coming, first of all, Haig. I really appreciate it. And it is a very challenging question what you're asking, because if the opposition is stronger and more resourceful and connected politically, and then it will be like a stumbling block, like a break, stopping the process of healing and peacemaking. And that's why I was vehemently against giving them any a moment of our conference, because we have procedures and they have to follow procedures. The fact that they came out like that vehemently and kept on talking, it seems like they're very traumatized themselves. Who in the right mind would do that? Or else they would write down what they wanted to say and ask a question at the end. Like any UN meetings, they can't do that in other meetings either. They're thinking just because we are not government, NGOs, non-governmental organization, that they have a right to bully us. And that's why I was a little aggressive, but I had to stop that process and respect the audience so that one perspective or revisionist perspective would not dominate. Like we have learned from our mistakes from the past. And that's the reason I was very vehement that everyone has to have follow the process. Now, our hope is that the numbers, like we were 100 people here and there were 2 that use that kind of approach. And I'm hoping as we grow and heal and come together in empathy and love and care, that becomes less and less powerful. And the mass of loving kindness and forgiveness will dominate. Not in a negative word, dominate, will be spreading around so that we don't have people being killed in Congo now or Sudan or Darfur. And it is happening now. And that's why I called on to people to really show how they can put their words into action. The action of doing something about what is going on now in other parts of the world. We keep, as Armenians, we keep crying over the same thing. But maybe 5% ever of Armenians really go out to African country to see what's going on there and how you can connect with them, because the same atrocities that I've heard from my ancestors and also through our research while we were studying the impact of genocide, we found the same things that is happening in Sierra Leone, in Congo, the same methods of chopping pregnant bellies and nipples, and the same methods. So it's like 100 years have passed, we're not evolving. So I'm so glad of this communication opening up through the website so we can inform the masses. But still the action is lagging behind, because at the end of the day, people are so tired of their work. They're saying, oh, let me turn off the TV. I don't want to hear what's going on in Congo because I don't even have energy. I live շունչ չունիմ, ժամանակ չունիմ ուրիշին հասնելու, հազիվ իմ ընտանիքիս եւ իմ ասկիս կհասնիմ։ Բայց it's շատ կարևոր է որ քու ասկեդ ավելի դուրս ելնել եւ ընդեսնել, որ էմպաթի ցցնել, սկալ որ մյուսներն ալ գծավին եւ թերևս մյուսներուն պաշտպանելու ջամփուն մենք ալ մեր հանգիստը պիտի գտնենք, որովհետև փամմերինք, լավ փամմերինք, օգնելով ուրիշ մեկը, որ արդեն գործանվի, գողկրդվի, քեդնին դա գանցնի։ Պետք է փամմենենք բոլորս ալ։ Կարևոր չէ որքան, բզդիկ փամմը, ադի քեզի լավ գսկացնե հոգեբես ալ, որովհետև you're not sitting idle, բարապ չես նստիր եւ փամմը գնես։
And you mentioned about some of the exciting projects that are coming ahead for you. You know, you said that you're going to Palestine and Israel, and you're going to Congo and other African countries. Can you elaborate a little bit more what's in store for you?
Yes. We have so far gone to 35 different countries and helping especially in peace building, conflict transformation, and healing the wounds of both natural and man-made disasters. So for this year, our plan is we're invited to go to Palestine, East Jerusalem, and work with Palestinian and Israeli groups that are intending peace and working on peace. So we're going to help them with the forgiveness because it's a totally new concept in peace building. They never integrated forgiveness. I'm not sure why, but now that they found out about our book and CD, they want me to do us as a team do workshops and show them how the process of forgiveness is. And then we're going to 3 countries in Africa. We start with Kenya, then Rwanda, and Democratic Republic of Congo for all peacekeeping, conflict resolution, train their people, go to the camps, work with the children in orphanages and in schools. And I mean, really, it's really opportunity for expanding our love to other people and really seeing the smile and the brilliance that comes in their eyes, even when we give them one pencil or one crayon or one bar of soap. So I would call on everyone to send me whatever they can. They're not using extra pens and crayons, coloring books, inch for Gernak Perel, 135 Cedar Street. You can we have a drop place there, and we'll take it to these missions. And in October, we're going to India to work in Punjab.
Շատ շնորհակալություն եւ ամենայն հաջողություն ձեր աշխատանքի մեջ։
Շատ շնորհակալ եմ Հայկ ջան, շատ երախտապարտ։
For several years now, April is named the Prevention of Genocide Month. Many political and social events take place during this time. Events not only dedicated to Armenian genocide, but to genocides throughout the world. Crimes against humanity, which are waiting for justice to be served, since the denial is the cause of more of these atrocities.